Welcome back to another video from skiboatpartsonline.com. My name is Ron, and today we're going to take a look at a fuel gauge that's not working. And we'll go through the diagnostics and troubleshooting on what is wrong. Is it the gauge? Is it the wiring? Is it the sending unit? So we're going to take a look at what's happening here. Okay, here is our fuel gauge. Right below that is the ignition switch. And I'm going to turn the ignition switch to on. Let's get this. And the gauge does nothing. If we look at the oil pressure, you'll see the oil pressure needle moving with a key on, off, on, off. But the fuel gauge is doing nothing. On, off, on, off. Okay, the tools that we're going to use to diagnose this are pretty simple. A jumper wire, you could even use just a paper clip. I mean, we're going to jumper is pretty short and easy. So jumper wire is one tool. A 12 volt test light or a volt ohm meter. A flashlight may be handy if we're going to be when we're under the dash and or on top of the fuel tank. So the next step is to locate the fuel sender on top of our fuel tank. Okay, here's our fuel sending unit. This is going to have a pink wire, typically pink, to the center post, and then a ground wire. First thing I want to do is make sure the wires appear tight, and they are tight. The next thing is I'm going to take a jumper, and I'm going to jumper between the ground wire and the center post. I got a jumper across there. Now we're going to go back up to the front. Okay, now our tank sending unit has a jumper right now between the top center post and the ground. And we're looking at the gauge. I'm going to take the ignition switch and I'm going to turn the ignition switch on and off. On, off. On, off. The needle is swinging all the way past full. That's telling me that the wiring from the sending unit all the way to the gauge and the gauge are all good. Okay, first thing we want to do before we remove the sending unit is to put a mark between the top of the sender and the tank with a Sharpie for the index, and I'll tell you why in just a few minutes. Next will be to remove the wires and the 5 screws that hold it in. Don't lose the little screws. New senders come with them, but sometimes they're a different size. Okay. Well, this sender's actually broken. It's not just a bad wiring, it's actually broken. Part of it came right out, but the swing arm is still in there. So it's going to take me a minute to get this out. Okay, most of our fuel sender is out. I'll go over that in a second on the bench. The next thing we need to do is measure the depth of the tank, because we're not going to put a swing arm style sender back in. We're going to put a reed switch style in. So we need to get the depth of the tank right where the sender is, and we're measuring 12 3/8 inches. So 12 3/8 from the bottom of the tank to the top of the tank. That's the number we need for our new sender. Okay, this is the remains of the sending unit that I took out of the tank. It is a swing arm style. However, the swing arm is still in the bottom of the tank and is going to remain there until someone removes the tank. It's not worth pulling the tank out just to find the old swing arm. But to show you how it's supposed to have looked, this is the same style sender with a swing arm. It's the swing arm and the float that go up and down that changes the resistance on these fine wires in here. Now, therein lies the problem. With modern sending units, all the sending units we're getting, the fine wire in here, these are all now imports, and they don't last. We're having problems with these things lasting 3 months, maybe 4 months, and they're shot again. So we no longer sell this style sending unit for fuel tanks. What we've gone to is a reed switch style. There are no exposed windings. The float goes up and down the stainless steel tube. Inside the tube are variable resistors and switches, little reed switches that open and close. So the bolt pattern will be the same. It'll drop in the same. This happens to be the 12-inch sender which we need for this job. Remember, we measured this tank. It was 12 3/8 inches deep. So the sender you want must be less than 12 3/8. You don't want this resting on the bottom of the tank. You want a little bit of gap above it. So with a 12 3/8 depth, we go with a 12-inch sender. Plus the gasket will have nearly a half-inch clearance at the bottom. So in this job, a 12-inch sender is the sender we want. Okay, on our old sender, we put a Sharpie marker on the top of the sender. Now this is important because even though there are 5 screws that appear to be evenly spaced, trust me, they're not. There is only one way that these will line up in the tank. So we know where this one came from. We're going to take the new gasket for the new sender. I'm going to place it on top, and I'm going to rotate it until all 5 holes line up perfectly. Take your time and make sure you get it right. And as soon as they all line up, all 5 screws line up. Now we're going to take, I can see where my marker is on the old one. I'm going to put a mark in the same place on this gasket. So now we have a mark on the new gasket. Next, I'm going to take and do the same thing with the new sender. We're going to rotate the gasket until all 5 holes line up perfectly. Again, take your time and get them right. Okay, the 5th rotation was the charm. Now I have my mark on the new gasket. I'm going to transfer that onto the new sender. So the new sender has a mark. The old sender has a mark. So this should drop right into the same hole, the same place in the tank without fighting it. Now we're going to go put it in. And by the way, the senders come with raw ends. Now in this case, I've taken and I've added a couple of heat shrink wire connectors, a male and a female quick connect. On the boat, we're going to reverse that and put a male and female to connect these up. Okay, we got our mark on the top of the sender transferred. I've pre-started the new screws so they're all in place. I'm going to hold the float up high so we can get this angled in there just right to get it slipped in. And rotate to our mark is right there. And then you're going to want to start these screws by hand. 5/16 socket. And they're all going down, all starting by hand. Okay, now we can buzz them in. Couple of screws left. Okay, she's bolted back in. Here are the two wires off of our new sending unit. There's a black and a white. Now, it really doesn't matter which wire you use, but I generally take the black and run it to the pink, the white to the ground. Now in this case, if I want to take this off, I put heat shrink male and female terminals on here, so all I have to do is plug them together. Okay, and our sending unit has been changed. Now it's time to test it. Okay, right now this boat has roughly 1/4 tank of fuel in it. The level line where the darker fuel is comes to right here, and that's roughly 1/4 tank. So let's power it up and see what we have. Okay, I'm back at the helm. I'm going to take the key and turn the key to on. Oh, look at that. We got a 1/4 tank of fuel. Off and on. Love it when a plan comes together. Okay, next we're going to take a look at if the gauge were bad, how we repair that. Okay, well now we're back in our electrical bench area of the parts room, and I've assembled a mock fuel gauge boat typical setup. Of course, now here's the old school type sending unit. Here is the new style reed switch, and I've wired these together to a new gauge, a fuel gauge here. Now, a few minutes ago we diagnosed that the sender was bad because we grounded the terminal post to a ground, and we found that the needle at the gauge swung all the way to full and back, and that proved the wiring from here back to the front was good and that the sender was bad, so we replaced the sender. Now, if you do this test and you short between these two and the needle up front at the gauge does not swing, now we need to find out, is the gauge bad or the wiring between the two bad? And that's what we're going to demonstrate here on the bench. Now I do have the new reed switch style sender connected, and this is a typical fuel gauge, and you're going to find 3 main wire terminals. The 4th one, which I don't have connected, is actually for the gauge illumination circuit or the backlighting. We don't need to demonstrate that, but the 3 that you're looking for are going to be called the S terminal. S is for sender, and it should have, for the fuel gauge, a pink wire attached. The ground is either going to have a G or a ground a pictorial symbol. Should have black wire. It's not uncommon to have 2 or 3 or 4 of them stacked on, daisy chained to the other gauges. And then the 3rd terminal is going to be the I terminal. I is for ignition, and it should have a purple wire, and that purple wire is typically daisy chained to the other gauges. So the I terminal for ignition is going to be hot when the key is on. When the ignition key is on, this becomes hot, therefore they call it the I terminal for ignition. For the sake of teaching here, if the shorted sending unit in the back of the boat did not result in swinging the needle gauge at all, now we need to move to the front of the boat, go under the dash, and or pull the dash panel away so we have access to the back side of the fuel gauge. So the very first thing we're going to do is, let's see if these wire terminals are tight. And in this case they are. Okay, we have good wiring terminals. The next thing we need to do is, do we have 12 volts present at the gauge when the key is on? Now, something you may want to remember is, if you have a kill switch on your boat, a tether switch, make sure that's plugged in before you do this, and then we're going to make sure that's on, and then we're going to turn our boat ignition on. Now you can use a voltmeter and just measure across the I terminal and the G for ground. We're showing 12.42 volts. You can use a simple test light. Most people have access. You can go to Harbor Freight and buy these for a couple dollars. The ground terminal and the I for ignition, and our light lights up in the gauge. So we have 12 volt power to the gauge. If we don't have 12 volt power to the gauge, you're going to need to trace this back and find out why. You've got a wiring issue, especially if the other gauges are working. Typically all gauges are going to be in the same fuse. So if this is the only gauge that's not working and you do not have power here, you've got a wiring issue, usually right there behind the dash. So assuming we have power at the gauge, shorting the sender at the back did not result in a needle swing. So now we need to do that needle swing test at the gauge itself, and to do that we're going to jumper between the ground and the S terminal. Do not go between the ground and the I terminal. If you do, you're going to blow a fuse and make sparks. That's not what we want to do. So we're going to take a jumper cable. You can just use a paper clip to jumper across these two, but for this we're going to use an actual ground or a jumper cable. I'm going to rotate this so you can see the gauge, and I'm going to temporarily hold this on the S terminal. And it's every time I touch the S terminal, the needle swings. Therefore the gauge is good. If you ground yours across and the needle does not swing, the gauge is bad. The gauge has to be replaced. While I've got this here, you can see how the two actually work in concert. I'm going to slide the float up and down, and the variable resistance inside that tube going through each reed switch. As the reed switch closes, it goes to that resistor and adjusts the correct resistance for the gauge reading. Pretty neat. But that's how we test the whole gauge system. I hope this was helpful. Tried to explain this as best I could. This is a pretty common issue, having a fuel gauge that doesn't work. 9 times out of 10 it is the sending unit. Now at Ski Boat Parts Online we do sell gauges. We sell a lot of the conversion kits for the medallion equipped boats. We also sell the newer reed switch style senders. We no longer sell these anymore because they simply don't hold up. The current line of manufacturers, these are all now created overseas, and the little winding wires in here are so small and so thin and cheap they just don't hold up. The reed switch style sender is a much better sending unit. However, you do have to pay strict attention to the length of the sending unit. And so we carry all of the common sizes in 1-inch increments. So I hope that helped you with your fuel gauge issues. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.